Hello and welcome to the Any Grief Goes podcast. I'm Brienne and today I have Laurie with me and I'm really excited to have you, Laurie. Would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I run an online therapy practice called The Curiously Kind Counsellor, and also author of a book called Speaking Grief, which is for grieving people in their 20s and 30s.
Thank you very much. And we have only just met very briefly before when we were discussing this podcast and I had never come across your website or your book before, so I was really excited to learn a little bit more about you. And I'm really loving what you do and like the focus that you have. So today we're probably going to focus on younger people who are grieving, and then neurodivergence and how people who are neurodivergent might grieve differently to others. So. But also, before we get there, we already spoke about the things that you are just so passionate about in grief. And one of those things that you're so passionate about is that there's literally no right or wrong way to grieve, despite what the world might be telling you. So tell us more about that.
Yeah, so certainly from my experience of grief, it was I remember the first time someone handed me like a leaflet about the 5 stages of grief, and I thought, wow, I'm pretty sure I went through all of these 5 stages and more in the first hour, let alone kind of over a period of time. And so as time went on, there was kind of this expectation that was not necessarily said, it was maybe more implied, but there was this kind of feeling of, well, why aren't you over this yet? And we're talking kind of just after the funeral, which for me was 10 days later. And I just thought, this doesn't make sense to me. And kind of over time, and then as I've moved into therapy work and kind of clinical practice and seen this in client work, I did research for my master's in this as well. And kind of the common theme was, why are people saying that we should grieve in a certain way when this isn't the experience?
And what conclusion did you come to?
There's rubbish. There is no right way to grieve, basically. Like, can we just strip this expectation? Because grievers are already having to do so much. Julia Samuels calls it grief works. I think that's the name of her book as well. And absolutely right. It is work. It is something that you are having to do. It's heavy. Let's just take away one of the expectations, which is that it should look a certain way within a certain timeline, because that's just not reality.
Yeah. Who do you think is it, or what do you think is it in society that puts this expectation on us as grievers?
Possibly the fact, so I call our society grief illiterate, because we just don't get it. It's almost kind of, unless you've had that experience, you don't really understand what it's like to be in it. And I think sometimes comments can be very well-meaning. There can be a lot of good intention when people respond to grieving people, but unfortunately what it actually does is minimize people's experience, or dismisses or invalidates what they're feeling. And I sometimes wonder if that comes down to comfort and discomfort. You know, if these people that are trying to support know that realistically they're trying to fix the unfixable, that's uncomfortable. That's uncomfortable to sit with. And we don't want to see friends and family in absolute pain and distress. Of course we don't. But we also can't pull them out of it either, no matter how much we want to.
Yeah, and I think sometimes those kind of comments, again, like you said, they're well-meaning, but they can make people retreat even more. And then people come to the conclusion that actually you're not a safe person to discuss this with, or I can't bring it up with this group of people. And that, it diminishes someone's world almost.
Yeah. And then by the time they walk into maybe a therapy or a coaching space, they're going, well, this thing happened 2 years ago and I don't understand why I'm not over it yet. And it's like, well, let's just go back a minute. What support have you had in those 2 years? And often you hear, well, people were well-meaning, but I didn't really feel like I could talk to them. And so actually, well, grief is still there then, because it's had nowhere to go. It's just had to basically be silenced for however long.
Yeah, and people can do that for a huge number of years, and well, just like you're saying, there's no way to grieve right or wrong. There's also no number of years that is almost embarrassing. I think people sometimes think it's embarrassing, or maybe it's been 2 years or 5 years or whatever, and I haven't dealt with this, and they can feel ashamed or embarrassed of that. But that's not right either, because there's, like you said, there's hundreds of reasons that keep grief suppressed.
Yeah, shame's a big one. If we feel that there's this expectation and we're not fulfilling it, often we will turn that inwards. We will look at ourselves and go, well, what are we doing wrong in this? What is fundamentally wrong with ourselves that we aren't fitting this supposed narrative?
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say that. When you're in your practice, just out of interest, do you find that more with younger people or of like any age?
Any age. You see this across kind of all genders, all demographics, all different types of grief, even if we're talking about non-death loss as well. There is this real sense of, why haven't I been able to move on? And I think for me, there's a clear distinction, because in grief, we're not asking people, or we shouldn't be asking people to move on. We should be looking at moving forwards, which for me, okay, they can sound the same on the surface, but moving on kind of gives this impression of, this person that's died is left here and we carry on our life. But actually what we're talking about is, how do we bring that person forward with us in our lives? Because how can we forget someone that important to us?
Yeah, absolutely. And is there a way that you specifically work with that kind of shame of people thinking that it's their fault that they haven't grieved, whether it's their fault that people have not been able to respond to them in a way that they need?
Yeah, so one of the things around for me was grief theories and models that exist. They have a place. Yes, they describe certain things in certain ways. And yes, for some people, they really gel with them and maybe we'll use those. But for the people who don't, and I see this a lot with young adults, I created a different model called time. And that is more kind of a movable process, as opposed to, here are 4 tasks, or here's 5 stages, or whatever ones are out there. This is more around, sometimes grief is going to feel integrated. Sometimes you are going to feel like grief isn't in the forefront of your mind, and you are living your day-to-day life and you are doing different things and you are moving forward. But at times, grief is going to re-emerge. For example, if we lose a parent quite young, we're talking about future milestones, having a baby, getting married. All of those things bring up this sense of, but that person isn't here to see it. And that's the model I use for clients, which is around, okay, so grief doesn't feel like this big thing normally, but now this big event is happening in your life and suddenly that grief is there again, it's at the surface. That doesn't mean that it's you're going backwards. That's something I hear quite often, is this feeling of, oh, I'm going backwards in my grief. It's more around, okay, so how is grief showing up for you now? What is it telling you? What meaning does it have in your life as it is now, not as it was then?
Yeah. I think it's important when you say it's movable, because I think that is potentially one of the things that could be missing from the grief models and theories. It's been a while since there's been a modern theory actually on grief. Can you tell us a little bit more detail about yours? So the acronym is TIME, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit more about that and each of the letters?
Yeah, so the reason it came about is because often you hear that phrase, time as a healer, and people would say, well, 2 years, 5 years, X amount of time has moved on. Time isn't really healing anything. And actually, time itself doesn't heal. It's what we do in that time. So for me, that was about 4 different parts. So the T stands for talking, and then the E is for expression. So for me, that's around those people that need to talk, particularly neurodivergent individuals. I'm neurodivergent myself, and one of the things that really helps me in my process is being able to hear myself say what I'm thinking or feeling. For other people, they don't like that, or they struggle with that maybe. So expression is kind of the more the creative stuff. Maybe it's writing, maybe it's art, maybe it's music, whatever it looks like for someone. Those are the active elements for me. Those things, particularly maybe in the early days, they're kind of the bigger bits. They're the bits that help us really understand and make meaning and make sense of grief and what it is for us. And then I is the integration piece. So I really struggle with the word acceptance. It comes with a finality to it. There's oh, well, I've reached acceptance, so that's it. And again, people I work with say, but how can I get to an end point and then just forget? Or how can I accept something that actually is unacceptable. So for me, integration is more about, okay, so how can grief live with you? How can grief live alongside you? And for me, that's that integration piece. So as I was saying before, grief might look like it's kind of in the background now of your life. It's there and it's something that you've experienced, but it's not at the forefront. Then when maybe we have a graduation or we have our first child or we get married, whatever it is, when that person isn't there, integration maybe shrinks because grief is bigger at that point, because we haven't experienced or haven't grieved what it means for that person to not be there for that life event. And then the M is movement, which stands for two different strands. That might be engaging the body in grief. It's not just emotions and thoughts and feelings. It's actually also held in the body. And how can we use that? Anger in particular is one of the emotions that has a lot of energy behind it. So I'm often talking with people about, okay, so when we feel like that, we often need to get it out in a physical way. What can we do to move? And what difference does that make? And then movement also represents the fact that life moves and we move with it and grief comes with us. And so that represents that integration maybe growing and then shrinking again.
That sounds fantastic. How did you come about? That was not a grammatical sentence. How did you come up with this this model?
It was kind of a bit of a I don't really know. It was one of those things that just kind of evolved out of some research I did. So for my master's, I researched the impact of losing a parent in young adulthood. And a lot of the common themes were around, but I have to live with this for such a long period of time. Often when we're talking about parent loss, we're talking kind of people being older. And whilst that's absolutely no less easy, often those big life milestones have already happened. So for younger adults, they've got to face those without that parent there. So there was kind of a mix of the conversations that we'd had maybe there in terms of what it's like to have grief keep resurfacing. Often that phrase kept coming up around, well, everyone says time is a healer and actually it's not. And then for me, it was what parts of grief are constantly moving. What parts of grief do we need to have more active? I don't quite know what the word is, but what parts of grief do we need to be more active in maybe? And yeah, that's where this came from essentially. But it was so long ago since I created it, but I've sat on it for a long time, from imposter syndrome probably. But the more I've been sharing it recently, the more people are going, this really makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does really make sense. And it makes sense because it's something that you can dip in and out of at different times, isn't it? And it's not something that you have to start at the beginning and then you go through it. It's something that you can experience random parts of it at any given day. You'll go back and forth throughout them. Yeah. So such an easy model for people to understand in that way. Is that what you've found? Have you used it? Are you using it with clients and what are you finding?
Yeah, so I bring it in as another option. With any kind of theory or model, I always throw it in with clients in terms of, does this fit for you? Does it resonate? If it does, great, let's use it. And if it doesn't, that's okay. And for me, it's for the clients that really struggle with those existing models. They just don't fit. They don't quite reflect what their kind of day-to-day lives are like. And for me, this was about normalizing their experience and saying, this isn't about you doing something wrong. It's about the message out there being wrong, because you are not the problem. The messaging around grief is the problem, because actually it doesn't have a fixed endpoint. I sometimes wonder if that idea of a fixed endpoint is a fantasy. It's that kind of, there's a nice feeling of, okay, well, we just get through this and we get to the end of it. Particularly if I think about back in the very early days, you desperately want to be out of that feeling and the depths that you're in. And so it makes sense that you want there to be an endpoint. But actually, once you start to reach those kind of milestones and you see that there isn't an endpoint, but it does feel very different to the beginning, you start to see, actually, this isn't what grief is going to look like, and it is going to look different.
Yeah. And in the early days, it's so hard to even comprehend that, right? That it will change.
Yes. Yeah.
So you are quite passionate about young people, 20s and 30s. What struck me when you were talking about those milestone moments that when you lose a parent younger, you're not going to have. I was also thinking about, other things that when you lose a parent young, you're not going to have. Perhaps that kind of like continued guidance, depending on how young you were. Maybe there was more parenting to be done, or there was more guidance or more life tips and advice that were to come. And now suddenly you've got to figure it out. And maybe you've got another family member or an uncle or somebody, but maybe you are literally on your own. And for a young person that doesn't have as much life experience as like you say, I think most people might. I think the average age must be like late 40s or 50s, or early 50s that you might lose a parent. But people in that young age, there's so much that they have missed out on. What made you so passionate about this area and wanting to support people who are having that experience?
Yeah, so I lost a parent at 22 and absolutely relate to what you're saying. You get to 18 and there's this this magical expectation that you reach 18, you've reached adulthood, so off you go, fly the nest. But actually the reality is we don't live like that. Often at 18, we are experiencing our first set of independence, if you like. If you think about going away to university, that's the first time that you're living on your own. You're living, yes, with other people, but independently from your family. You're having to navigate finances. And often there is still a reliance on that family unit back home, or still in your life if you're not away from home. For that to be cut short is, you are then faced with something that you know is going to happen one day, but it's that assumptive world of it will happen one day and one day is never going to come.
Well,
And for me, it was a short, sharp shock to the system of actually this can happen and this has happened. And suddenly you're a sense of safety, essentially. Parents offer a sense of safety in the world. And when that is cut short, you're suddenly faced with actually anything can happen, because it actually already has. And so you don't have that protection of the assumptive world that we live in anymore. I wrote about this once and described it as a bit like, you imagine gravity is always going to be there. You imagine your parents are always going to be there. They're kind of the same thing. And often you are in isolation. I think the latest stats said that there's 1 in 7 18 to 35-year-olds that lose a parent. And whilst that sounds at least 7 people often in life, so you can imagine someone, but because there's so much taboo around grief still, and there's so much isolation that still exists because people don't know how to talk about it when they have experienced, and people don't know how to support people who are grieving, you don't know anyone else that has experienced it, even though you probably do, if that makes sense. You probably do know someone, but because no one's talking about it, you just don't have that support network in the same way. You're experiencing something that's out of the ordinary. It's what I call an out of order death, because it hasn't happened as the life cycle should happen. So then you feel kind of cut off from everyone, because you're in this bubble experiencing this enormous thing and going, well, no one's getting this. No one's understanding what I'm experiencing.
yeah. And I think this also, I know that some 18 to 20-year-olds, I know they're super bright and they're super clever, and that they, in many ways, they are adult, but in so many ways they aren't, because there's so many things they haven't come across and have no idea that could even happen in life, right? Because just as you're saying, that assumptive world theory. And all of the things that come along with grief are huge. Like the emotions are huge, probably bigger than they've ever experienced ever before. What's the best way to help young people in their kind of early grief?
I would love to see more community-based things that are in these areas where young people already are, because I think if someone is experiencing something where they don't know what support they need, they don't know where to go and look for it, often they kind of retreat. I think that's the word you used earlier. They kind of go back into themselves because they don't know where to go and look for support. But actually, if there are things in place maybe in schools or in colleges or universities where these young people predominantly are, that support is there. It's more talked about, it's more normalised, because they they know that those services are there. For example, someone explained to me once that they lost a parent at secondary school and even their teachers ignored them because they didn't know how to respond to them. And for me, it was like, that's such a missed opportunity. You've got art teachers, you've got drama teachers, you've got PE teachers in schools. You have skill sets. You can implement them in schools very quickly and very easily, budgets and things withstanding.
That is such a good point. Because, you know, therapy coaches, they're brilliant. But when you're young as well, it's not like you're even in work to be able to afford those things, right? And with the NHS, any kind of support is very small, very short, maybe just a few sessions and not enough to really get somewhere in grief, I don't think. But yeah, that community support, what you're kind of suggesting actually sounds fantastic. You're right about that skill set, and it works with your model, doesn't it? That movement, that expression, that creativity, that let's get it out of us. Yeah, now I'm wondering why that isn't happening, because it wouldn't actually take much resource, would it? These people already know how to facilitate, they already know how to hold space. The resources wouldn't be massive, really. It just, yeah.
And would be the biggest resource, which we all know school staff are massively overstretched already.
Yeah.
But I come back to how much time is wasted in classrooms. If, again, I can't remember the full stats off the top of my head, but it's something like 1 child in every classroom in a secondary school has lost a parent. How much time is lost in sessions, or class times I should say, to misbehaviour, and that misbehaviour is caused because some young person is out there grieving and has no structure, no support, no one to have those conversations with. There was I can't remember which series it was, but there was a clip in Educating Yorkshire on Channel 4, and there was this teenage boy who just would not go to lessons. He was so angry, and it was like, just put him in a room with a boxing bag, some boxing gloves, and a PE teacher. Just let him get it out.
Oh,
And yet there's 3 members of staff wandering around the school looking for him. It
yeah.
baffles me.
I mean, yeah, because it just makes sense, doesn't it? Because when I think about stories like that, I don't work with young people, but when I think about stories like that, like, you know, a bit of your heart literally breaks when you think about a young person, especially just being so alone with big feelings like that. And yeah, somebody out there, like, get this to happen. Because I'm thinking it's a really good opportunity, isn't it, to integrate grief awareness with actually grief expression, because you could bring there are times where it would be appropriate, you could possibly bring other people in as well, even if they haven't experienced a death of a parent. Just let's get some education, and let's get some just general knowledge of grief that you can apply to, like you say, non-death griefs, you know, as well.
Yeah. And they, certainly from the young adults I spoke to, they were quite clear on, I don't want to hear a teacher say, oh, well, I lost a parent. Because when you're kind of 14, 15, teachers, even if they're kind of newly qualified and they're in their early 20s, don't seem like they're on a similar age level to you. So they don't want to hear, oh, yeah, I lost a parent, so I understand. They want someone to just sit there and say, tell me how it is for you, and to listen without trying to fix it, because nobody can fix it.
Yeah. But people are so desperate to, and that's where we get it wrong. That desperation to fix. Also, you can never say, I mean, it's never a good idea to compare your grief with somebody else's, no matter what stage or age or who the person was. It's never a good idea to tell a griever that, oh, I have experienced what you've experienced. You know, there's 100 factors that are influencing how someone's grieving, and you don't understand. You don't understand that specific person's experience of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, the comparisons to pet loss. When you hear someone say, my pet hamster died, to someone who's just lost a parent, and it's like, your pet hamster might have meant a hell of a lot to you, but your grief process is very, very different to someone who's lost a parent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And neither is worse. They
Yeah.
are just different.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's what I always try and encourage people to remember, is no grief is better or worse. They are all just different.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally on board with that. Let's talk about your book, because your book is like an excellent resource for younger people, young adults. And I bought it. And what I love about it is literally an A to Z of what you just might experience, and normalizing it and letting you know what you might expect. And then here's some journal prompts on how to explore it. Or and it's just so succinct and it's so helpful. I'm impressed that you got X and Z, because I wouldn't have known how to have done that. That's your therapy background, I'm sure. Um,
That was a thesaurus.
um, tell us about the book, because I think it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, when I was doing my research, there was a lot of, I wanted to be handed a guide and told what I was feeling and why I was feeling it. And that really resonated with me. Losing a parent was the first time I'd experienced grief of any kind. My grandparents outlived my parents, so for me it was my first experience, and I was just thrown into this world of, I have no idea how I feel or when I'm feeling it. I just was all over the place. So Speaking Grief was designed as an A to Z on purpose, because it was meant to be it's a dip in, dip out. So if you feel a certain way, you can just dip into that chapter, read what I have to say about it, which the idea behind it is to normalize, this is what it feels like and might be why it feels that way. And then, yeah, like you say, each chapter comes with journal prompts, because I wanted the book to be something that could kind of go through that journey with you. So you might only have the capacity to be able to read the chapter at the time, thinking kind of about early grief, when you don't have kind of the concentration to be able to sit and read long chapters. So I kept them short, they're between 2 and 4 pages. And then as kind of grief goes over time, the journal prompts are there if you want to explore that feeling in a bit more depth, or there is a feeling that keeps coming back up and you're not sure why. And again, like you say, therapy is not easily accessible, neither is coaching. There are very limited free options out there, and private options are very expensive. So this was a way of saying, okay, well, if therapy isn't, or coaching isn't accessible, here's a kind of it's meant to be almost like a companion alongside. It's absolutely not therapy, but it's there to maybe prompt something that helps you write about what you're feeling or what you've been experiencing.
It is really accessible, and it's also important to say that there are people like us, obviously, who want to read every book, and we're really into the theory and we know all the stuff. But you don't have to know all the stuff when you're grieving, right? This is why your book is so great, because other books are perhaps just more long-winded, or you have to go really deep in them to find what you might be looking for or what might be helpful. But yours is so easy to know. Actually, here's where you go, and let's just a snapshot. A snapshot, I think, especially in those early days, are all you need. You don't need to get bogged down in analyzing grief. You just need to say, okay, this is something I can relate to. This is something I can use, and let me just experience it from here.
Yeah, and it's designed to be written in a way of, you might feel any one of these things, you might feel all of them, or you might feel none of them, and any one of those is okay. You might feel one of these emotions and that's all you feel forever. That's okay too. For me, it was about trying to get across that there aren't certain feelings. We hear about anger and sadness, but actually that there's so much more to it. We talk about the anger iceberg, where anger's secondary and there's often things underneath it, but arguably sadness is too. Yes, we are sad when someone dies, but often that comes with other things.
Yeah. I think the parallels to what we're going to talk about today is for young people, but also people who are neurodivergent. What also struck me about the book, that it is also very accessible if you were to be neurodivergent. Was that on purpose, or was that just a byproduct of how you were setting things out anyway?
It absolutely was not intentional. So when I wrote the book, I had no idea I was neurodivergent. I completely clueless. I just happened to be doing some CPD shortly after the book was published and realised. And so I think that potentially naturally lends itself to neurodivergent people, because it's written from a neurodivergent perspective. And again, you see a lot of books where it might be written about someone's experience of grief as a neurodivergent person, but often some of the feedback and the criticism is, this is still telling me your process. So I was very, very mindful when I wrote the book that I didn't want to write a memoir, because that is my individual experience. And yes, some of it might be relatable. Yes, some of the themes might resonate. But what I really wanted to put out there was the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences that you could have, but not in any particular order. And that I think is where the A to Z came from, because it was, if I write this in any other order, there's the potential for it to be seen as it should happen in this order. Whereas A to Z was, let's just make this accessible.
Yeah, I think it's great. I haven't seen another book set out like that, and like I say, it's so easy to find what you're looking for. Tell me then about when you first started to be aware of neurodivergence and grief and the links, and how does being neurodivergent impact grief?
Comes back to that, why am I not grieving in the way that I'm expected to grieve? So often in neurodivergent individuals, they will grieve differently. I can't tell you how any one neurodivergent person will grieve, because I can't tell you how any one single person will grieve, neurodivergent or otherwise. But there are some commonalities amongst them. So they talk about, if we take monotropic focus, for example. So monotropic focus is where someone who is neurodivergent can only focus on one thing at a time, and they need to focus on that one thing. They will process that one thing, and then they'll move on to the next one. In that sense, they can appear stuck, but actually they're not stuck. They're just in their way of processing. But grief can also disrupt that. So if we think about kind of the early days, and if there's involvement in maybe the admin, suddenly you're forced into polytropic focusing, because you've suddenly got to try and remember to spin 10 different plates. And actually that can then increase neurodivergent burnout, because that's asking them to focus in a way that is not their way of naturally focusing. Something that's also not talked about very often is RSD and grief. So rejection sensitivity can be triggered by grief. Already, if a neurodivergent person is experiencing RSD, there's that theme of, why am I not enough? And then suddenly it's, why am I not enough for them to stay, regardless of how they died? So that can be in the mix. And there's it's gone. I've completely gone out of my head. It'll come back. But basically there are kind of commonalities within neurodivergence that actually is triggered by grief.
No, that's really interesting, because say you didn't know that you were neurodivergent, that could make grief an even an already existing complicated thing like 100 times worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Because no one understands your process. No one understands why you can be they call it puddle jumping in children. So one minute they'll be focused on their grief, the next they'll jump out of it and they'll be completely focused on the here and now. Neurodivergence is kind of similar in that sense. You can be really focused in on grief. You can be kind of really emotionally flooded by it, or you feel things really, really intensely, and then the next moment you've kind of shut off from it. And that's, I guess, partly just the body trying to respond, and the brain going, okay, this is too much. We need to come away from this. But often you see this in neurodivergence as extremes of kind of numbing and coming away from grief, and then intensely feeling grief. And sometimes we're not necessarily talking kind of in the same day or in the same week. We're talking kind of over a period of time. I know for me, for example, as I carried on as normal for about 2 weeks, because I just needed to be away from it. And then once it hit, I was then intensely experiencing that grief. And then I would say that was pretty much my process over a period of time, where I'd be completely away from it and then I'd be really in it. And I wouldn't have the ability to kind of come out of it in a way that neurotypicals talk about.
So that's hard, isn't it? Because now I'm thinking about, not only is that difficult to do for the person, you've already got perhaps a lot of people around you that already don't understand grief, that already are a little bit stigmatizing about when you should be over it and how people are grieving. You know, if people don't cry, people are like, oh, did you notice that they haven't cried? And now all of a sudden there's a possibility for someone who is neurodivergent to experience even more stigma as well.
Yeah, and that reminds me of stimming. So often neurodivergent people will stim to support emotional regulation. And when they're grieving, that might be the sign that they are grieving, but not in a way that you expect or you anticipated they might grieve. But if you have someone who doesn't know that they're neurodivergent and they have been masking pretty much their whole life, that's just another thing that they have to mask.
Mm.
But often there's no capacity for that because you're already out at capacity from grief.
Yeah. How do you work with that? What's your best advice for people who are neurodivergent or suspect they might be and they're grieving? What can you say to them?
The same as I would say to anyone else, your grief is your grief, and how you grieve is absolutely fine because it is your process and no one else has the right to tell you that it's right or it's wrong. It's if that's how you need to move through it. Something else that just popped into my mind then is that often we talk about maybe more in ADHD, but just generally kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Yes.
So particularly when we're talking about maybe anniversaries later down the line or milestones, they might not even know grief is in the picture. And so if we can hold that awareness, we can support those people and go, well, I'm wondering if this is around. And often people go, oh, well, I don't want to do that because then I'm going to remind them that their person's died. But they already know.
Yeah, yeah.
They already remember.
Yeah, that's the thing that gets me the most is when people don't ever say anything. It's because we don't want to upset them, but they're already upset. Every griever's already upset. You can't do any more damage.
Yeah, they're more upset that you've forgotten or you seemingly have forgotten their person. You don't want to mention their name. They are not upset if you mention their name.
Exactly. Um, It's interesting what you just said though, because I think so neurotypical people and the people in the lives of people who are neurodivergent that might be grieving, they do have a special opportunity based on what you're saying to actually help facilitate some grief or help hold it or help notice it and gently kind of be there for somebody. Yeah, what would you say to people that whose loved one is neurodivergent and they're grieving and how they can do that?
Respond to what you see. If a neurodivergent person is in that kind of real emotional intense stage, support them in that. If they are distracted away from it, if they are numb, if they're, for want of a better word, avoiding it, let them avoid it. And I say that whether they're neurodivergent or they're neurotypical. We often say, or we often frame avoidance as a bad thing, but actually avoidance needs to be part of the process because we cannot stay in grief indefinitely. We have to move in and out of it because we just can't process like that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, you had some awesome ideas for young people and having accessible grief grief support. Is there anything that would make grief support more accessible to somebody who's neurodivergent, or that a more appropriate way of managing it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there is, but I don't have anything off the top of my head. But I come back to where are those people and how can grief support be in those spaces already? That for me, I think kind of widens out from maybe young adults into spaces generally. There was a baby loss charity, I think. They set up like a football group for men, for dads that had experienced baby loss. And it was like, they don't have to talk about grief, but they do know that everyone else there has lost someone.
Yeah.
And it's things like that. It's like, how can we have more community spaces that are set up for specific grieving groups? But they don't have to talk about grief. They don't have to go to a group therapy session. They can go and do the activity. And if they want to talk about it, they know people get it.
Yeah, that reminds me. There's a local community interest company here called Remembering Together, and it's a craft group. And you go and do crafts, and if you want to talk about grief, talk about grief. If you don't, then ditch do your crafts, and it's just like a nice space for that. So yeah, I think more spaces like that would be amazing.
Yeah. And it's another outlet. It's another way of expressing grief because you're doing the thing.
Yeah. I'm just going to flip something around just a second. I want to just wanting to know your thoughts on this. Um, So my husband he's late 40s, has got a recent diagnosis of ADHD. And it's interesting watching someone of that age be diagnosed and then them almost rethinking their whole entire lives, which got me thinking how just the diagnosis itself could be a form of grief.
100%, because suddenly you're reflecting back and going, but if I'd known, what would life have been like? You're grieving the person you could have been if you had known, if support had been put in place. I often say that I'm glad I didn't know, because I believe outside of the family, but systems that I was in, school, for example, would have written off me as a neurodivergent kid. Individual teachers would stand, kind of, they may not have done, but just generally as systems, it would have been, oh, well, she can't do it, so it's just because she's neurodivergent, don't worry about it. So for me, there was a grief around, but my life could have been so different. I could have understood myself in a different way, particularly when it came to parent loss as well. I would have understood why my grief was so different, and I maybe wouldn't have hidden it for so long. But in the same way, there's also a relief for me that I didn't know till now, because now I do know. I get to reset the rules. I get to choose. We talk about kind of those core beliefs that you learn early on in life, where you learn that you're not good enough if you don't do X, Y, or Z, for example. Now I get to choose. Now no system is telling me, well, you're neurodivergent, so you can or can't do this. I get to say, I'm neurodivergent and I'm still going to do that thing.
To me, that sounds like quite a healthy way to manage that grief of the what ifs. That with all the knowledge I have now as an adult, I can now choose how I go about life.
Yeah. And that doesn't go to say that I haven't had those moments where I've got really angry or really sad about what came before. But yeah, there's something empowering about going, well, I'm learning this as an adult, so I get to choose. I get to set the narrative for the rest of my life now.
Mm. Can you say something about kind of masking in grief and how a neurodivergent person might mask in either of those circumstances? Maybe there's been a bereavement, or maybe actually coming to terms with, actually, I can unmask now and I haven't been able to for so long.
Yeah, I think with the latter, there's almost a kind of well, I didn't know I was masking. And so there's that relearning, there's that, is what I'm doing masking? And if it is masking, do I still want to do it? A really silly example is I nipped into my local M&S food hall recently, and it was really busy. It was really overwhelming. I just was like, I need to get out of here. And I wanted something. I couldn't do it easily. And before, I would have gone, you're being ridiculous. You're an adult. Go get the thing. And this time I was like, this is costing me too much of my energy and it doesn't really matter that much. So I didn't do it. And I think that for me is that I can now make an active choice rather than doing something out of feeling like, well, I'm an adult, so I should be able to do that thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost very loosely, very loosely connected with like living amends, isn't it? Now that you know your diagnosis, you can choose to live a different way and almost give that promise back to yourself that you can, that, yeah, you won't, yeah, you can choose, you don't have to do that. Okay, yeah, great.
They talk about radical self-compassion when you get a late diagnosis, because often, well, I think it was something like you hear like in the 100,000 more, there's something like 10,000 or 100,000 more negative comments by the age of 12 as a neurodivergent child than a neurotypical child.
Wow.
So often neurodivergents are very self-critical, they're very self-shaming because they live, or maybe not self-shaming, but the shame sits within themselves is what I mean by that term. So there's this real like learning to respond to yourself differently. There's that sense of, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's okay that I can't do that thing, essentially. And some people hear that as an excuse, but it's not an excuse. It's about going, this is how we talk about spoon theory. How many spoons do I have? And is that thing worth that spoon? Because if it isn't, I'm already losing spoons just having to navigate a neurotypical world.
Yeah, it's very tough. Very tough. Okay, so let's take us back then to the bereavement kind of grief and masking. What can you tell us about that?
So again, because I didn't know then, I would struggle to differentiate between neurodivergent and neurotypical in terms of responses to grief. I guess for me, there's risks involved. So often neurodivergent, or again, this might be more ADHD focused, but there is a higher risk of addiction in those individuals, irrespective of grief. And we already know that grief is a factor in addiction as well. So those risk factors, when we start to add grief into the mix, become higher because there's another contributing factor. Being busy is another one. For me, I had to be thrown into whatever I was doing, and I guess now the phrase would be hyper-focused. So something would grab my attention and I would be tunnel vision on that thing until I was ready to come back out of it. And that, for me, wasn't until a few years later. I was not ready to sit with and understand and process my grief until about 4 years after it happened.
So I guess with a neurodivergent person, you have to just let that process unfold as it is, and that's the process. But obviously, if that person would like to get support, then that can be, you know, an intervention can happen in a more gentle way that is appropriate for the specific person to help them with that. Yeah.
Yeah, let them lead. Let them tell you what they need or what they might like or what they want to try. I think sometimes, again, not just maybe with neurodivergence, but just generally, we can dictate to people because we feel so uncomfortable. I myself have fallen into this trap where I've seen someone grieving and I've just wanted to be like, can you please come out of this? Because I don't know how to help you. And actually, when that person goes, this is what I need, or when that person says, I think I need some support and this is what I'd like to try, they are far more engaged because it is coming from them than when someone says, I think you need X. And then they're almost forced or pushed into doing whatever it is, and they're not necessarily ready for it.
Yeah. I think that's what makes people uncomfortable, isn't it? That little bit in between where someone isn't ready. People are like, oh, what do we do? What do we do?
Yeah.
And the answer is just be with them, right? The answer is just your presence mostly.
Yeah, and I mean, there are going to be exceptions to this. If someone is in significant distress, for example, and they are refusing support, then absolutely getting other services involved, particularly that person's GP, for example. Absolutely having those people there present, providing support, and maybe that person does need a nudge into that. But we're talking about people that are in significant distress to the point that maybe they can't keep themselves safe. But if someone is living autonomously and has that agency to say, look, this is really painful, but I can keep myself safe, then they are in a position to choose what and when and if they want support.
Would you suggest or recommend that a neurodivergent person would do better with a neurodivergent professional?
There's a big debate around this
Is there? Tell
in the
me.
therapy world. I don't know if there is in the coaching world, but there is in the therapy world. I don't know, is my answer. Many neurodivergent clients, whether that's therapy or coaching, have been harmed in therapy because the therapist has not understood that they don't need to change to fit into neurotypical standards. So I can understand why there is this big, if you're neurodivergent, you should seek support from someone who's neurodivergent. But if you have a therapist or a coach who can just meet you where you're at and help you find ways of being in the world that fit your natural process, maybe those people are rare. I don't know. But for me, when I seek therapy, I don't look for certain demographics like that. I don't look for, are you neurodivergent? I look for, can you meet me where I'm at? And can you sit with me in that? And can you sit with me in my process? And if the answer is yes, then you're a good fit for me.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I could probably talk to you for ages, but the podcast is only a certain amount of time. So we're going to wrap it up. But is there anything that we haven't covered that you would just really think is important to tell the world or let people know?
Just let grieving people grieve in peace. For me, it's a horrendous experience for someone in grief. It's painful, it's long, and it can feel very, very heavy for a very, very long time. one of the best things we can do to support someone in that process is to just take away any expectation that they should be somewhere at some point at some particular time frame. That for me is my biggest message to everyone, is just let grieving people grieve in their way.
Yeah, thank you very much. And lastly, I mean, do you niche as a therapist? Are you exclusively grief?
No, so my therapy practice sits around kind of more overthinking, self-doubt, those kind of things. That's kind of the common thread amongst my work. But grief and loss and grief in young adulthood is a particular interest of mine. So it does sit alongside my work.
So tell people where they can find you, and we'll finish.
You will. So I have a website under the Curiously Kind Counsellor. I do have an Instagram presence, but I really hate social media as a therapist because it's full of, you just need this one hack wonder, or you just need these 5 steps. And I'm not that therapist. So I am on there. You will find some old content, but I'm not on there regularly.
Okay, so website is the main source of contact with you. Great. All
Or
right.
you can find me in my book.
We can find the book, which is Speaking Grief, Laurie Hole. I got it off Amazon. Sorry, I don't. I'm sure. Is it available other places?
It's available in all 3 formats on Amazon, and then local bookshops. If people do want to support local, they can order the paperback version.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks so much for your time, Laurie.
Thank you.